Imagine a room full of men in Berlin, 14 nations, not one African among them. They have maps spread across mahogany tables, ink, rulers, pencils, and they are dividing an entire continent, not through war, not through negotiation with the people who live there, through lines on paper. In 1884, Europe gathered to carve up Africa like it was property at an estate sale. They called it a conference, they called it diplomacy, they called it progress. What they didn't call it was what it actually was: theft, planned, organized, legalized. And here's what nobody tells you in school. The scramble for Africa wasn't a scramble at all. It was methodical, it was calculated. It was one of the most efficient acts of coordinated dispossession in human history. And it happened in a single room, over the course of 3 months. Let that sink in. 3 months to decide the fate of hundreds of millions of people, thousands of kingdoms, centuries of civilization. You were told colonization just kind of happened, that Europeans explored, discovered, and gradually spread across the continent. That's not what happened. What happened was a meeting, a conference, a contract signed by men who had never set foot in most of the places they were claiming. This is the story they don't teach. Not because it's complicated, but because it's too clear. The scramble for Africa was not chaotic, it was business, and the product being sold was an entire continent. Let's start with what you weren't told. Before 1884, Africa was not empty. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was not a blank space on a map. Africa was organized. The Ashanti Empire controlled vast trade networks in gold and cola nuts. The Sokoto Caliphate governed territories larger than Western Europe. The Kingdom of Buganda had complex legal systems and diplomatic relations. The Zulu Kingdom had military strategies that would later be studied in European war colleges. These were not villages, these were nations. They had currencies, treaties, universities, armies, taxes, trade routes that stretched across the Sahara and down the coast. And Europe knew this. They had been trading with African kingdoms for centuries, buying gold, buying ivory, buying human beings. They knew Africa was rich. They knew it was organized. They knew it was powerful. That's exactly why they had to divide it in secret. Because if African kingdoms had been invited to the table, they would have said no. Think about what that means. Europe didn't conquer Africa and then divide it. They divided it first, on paper. Then they went in to enforce what they had already claimed. This is the part that gets erased in every textbook. The conquest didn't start with armies, it started with documents. The man who called the meeting was Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, a man who had never been to Africa, a man who openly admitted he didn't care about Africa, but he cared about Europe. And in 1884, Europe had a problem. The problem was competition. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Germany, all of them wanted African resources. All of them were making claims. And those claims were starting to overlap. Europeans were on the verge of going to war with each other over African land, not because they cared about Africa, because they cared about profit. So Bismarck did something brilliant. He invited them all to Berlin, not to stop the theft, to organize it. He framed it as a humanitarian mission. He said the goal was to bring Christianity and civilization to Africa, to end the slave trade, to protect African people. That language matters, because when you read the documents from the Berlin Conference, they don't talk about conquest. They talk about responsibility, duty, the white man's burden. This is how you legalize theft. You rename it. On November 15, 1884, representatives from 14 European nations sat down in Bismarck's palace. Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Ottoman Empire, Russia. The United States sent observers. Not one African kingdom was invited. Not the Ashanti, not the Zulu, not Buganda, not Ethiopia, not Sokoto. The people whose land was being divided were not in the room. Let that image sit with you. 14 European men in Berlin deciding the future of a continent they didn't own. And nobody thought this was strange. Nobody questioned the audacity, because in their minds, Africa didn't belong to Africans. It belonged to whoever could take it. That belief didn't come from ignorance. It came from intention. The conference lasted 3 months. They met, they debated, they drew lines, and here's what they agreed on. Any European nation could claim African land if they could prove effective occupation. That phrase is key. Effective occupation meant you had to actually be there. You couldn't just plant a flag and leave. You had to build a station, install administrators, show control. This is why the scramble accelerated so fast after 1884, because suddenly it wasn't enough to want African land. You had to occupy it before someone else did. So Europe flooded into Africa, not to explore, to claim. They built forts. They signed treaties with local leaders who didn't understand the terms. They installed governors in regions they couldn't even pronounce. And they did it fast. Between 1885 and 1914, almost the entire continent was colonized. 30 years, 54 territories, controlled by 7 European nations. This wasn't gradual expansion. This was a land grab, and it was legal, because they had written the rules in Berlin. Now, here's where it gets darker. The borders they drew weren't based on culture, or language, or kingdoms, or geography. They were based on convenience. A straight line here, a river there, a mountain range if it was easy to mark. They split ethnic groups down the middle. They forced rival kingdoms into the same colonies. They ignored centuries of established borders. The Somali people were divided between 5 different colonial territories. The Maasai were split between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The Bakongo kingdom was carved up between French, Belgian, and Portuguese control. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic, because a divided population is easier to control. If you put rival groups in the same territory, they fight each other instead of fighting you. If you separate a people from their kin across a border, they lose their collective power. Europe knew exactly what they were doing. They were breaking Africa on purpose, and the evidence is in the borders themselves. Go look at a map of Africa. You'll see straight lines cutting through deserts and forests, borders that make no geographic or cultural sense. Those lines were drawn in Berlin by men who had never seen the land they were dividing. Let's talk about King Leopold II of Belgium, because his story shows you how the conference worked in practice. Leopold wanted the Congo, not for Belgium, for himself. Personally, he had never been there. He didn't care about the Congolese people. He cared about rubber and ivory and profit. So he hired explorers. He sent Henry Morton Stanley into the Congo to sign treaties with local chiefs. But here's what Stanley did. He told chiefs they were signing trade agreements, partnerships, protection pacts. What they were actually signing were documents that gave Leopold ownership of their land. The chiefs couldn't read French. They didn't have lawyers. They didn't know they were signing away their sovereignty. And at the Berlin Conference, Leopold presented those treaties as proof of effective occupation. The Europeans looked at the signatures, they looked at the stations Stanley had built, and they said, "Fine, the Congo is yours." Just like that, a region 76 times the size of Belgium became the personal property of one man, not a colony of Belgium, the private property of the king. And what Leopold did next is one of the greatest atrocities in human history. He turned the Congo into a slave state. He forced the population to harvest rubber. If they didn't meet quotas, his soldiers cut off their hands. Entire villages were burned. Millions died. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was the system the Berlin Conference created, because once you say a European can own African land through paperwork, you've removed every moral boundary. Now think about what this means for the African kingdoms that existed before the conference. They didn't just lose land, they lost sovereignty. Take the Ashanti Empire, one of the most powerful states in West Africa. They had been trading with Europeans for centuries. They had defeated British armies multiple times. But after Berlin, Britain claimed the Gold Coast as their protectorate. The Ashanti didn't agree, so Britain invaded again and again, until finally, in 1900, they captured the Ashanti king and exiled him to the Seychelles. They dismantled the empire. They stole the golden stool. They erased the government, not because the Ashanti were weak. Because the British had a piece of paper from Berlin that said the Gold Coast belonged to them. The same thing happened to the Sokoto Caliphate, the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Zulu Kingdom, Buganda. One by one, Europe invaded states that had existed for centuries, states with armies, legal systems, economies, and they justified it by pointing to a conference that Africans were never part of. This is the part that textbooks skip. They tell you colonization happened. They don't tell you it was planned at a table in Berlin by men who had no right to the land they were claiming. And here's the question nobody asks. Why was this conference necessary? If Africa was so uncivilized, so chaotic, so backwards, why did Europe need a formal agreement to divide it? The answer is obvious: because African kingdoms were organized. They had power. They had trade relationships with each other and with Europe. If Europe had tried to conquer Africa without coordinating, they would have faced unified resistance. So they made sure that didn't happen. They divided the continent into zones before Africans could unify to defend it. They legalized the theft so it couldn't be challenged in European courts. They created a system where African sovereignty didn't exist on paper, which meant it didn't exist in practice. This wasn't colonization. This was preemptive dismantling. Let's talk about what happened to the maps. Before the Berlin Conference, European maps of Africa had blank spaces, regions marked unexplored, areas labeled with question marks. After the conference, those blank spaces were filled in, with borders, with names, with claims. But here's what's strange. Europeans hadn't actually explored those regions yet. They didn't know what was there. They hadn't surveyed the land or met the people. They just drew the borders anyway. And then they sent expeditions to discover what they had already claimed. Think about the arrogance in that. You claim land you've never seen. You draw borders around people you've never met. And then you call it discovery when you finally show up. This is how history gets written. The maps created in Berlin became the official maps. The borders drawn by Europeans became the recognized borders. And the African maps, the ones that showed kingdoms and trade routes and ethnic territories, were discarded, not because they were inaccurate, because they contradicted the new European claims. This is erasure at the cartographic level. Europe didn't just conquer Africa. They rewrote the physical representation of the continent to match their claims, and those maps are still in use today. Now let's talk about the language used at the conference, because the words matter. They didn't say conquest, they said protection. They didn't say exploitation, they said development. They didn't say theft, they said acquisition. This is how you justify the unjustifiable. You change the vocabulary. The official document from the Berlin Conference is called the General Act. It talks about freedom of trade, freedom of navigation, the abolition of slavery. It sounds progressive, humanitarian, but buried in that document is a single clause that changed everything. Article 35. It states that any European power claiming African territory must notify the other powers and prove effective occupation. That one sentence legalized the entire scramble. because it didn't say African kingdoms had to consent. It didn't say borders had to respect existing nations. It didn't say Africans had any rights to the land they lived on. It just said Europeans had to tell each other when they were taking territory. That's it. That's the clause that divided a continent. And it was written in the language of diplomacy, so it wouldn't sound like what it actually was: organized theft. Here's what happened immediately after the conference. France invaded West Africa. They claimed 8 territories: Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Benin. Britain took Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Zambia. Germany claimed Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo. Portugal expanded in Angola and Mozambique. Italy tried to take Ethiopia and failed, but succeeded in Somalia and Libya. Belgium took the Congo. Spain grabbed bits of Morocco and Western Sahara. In 30 years, the entire continent except Ethiopia and Liberia was under European control. This wasn't exploration. This was execution of a plan made in Berlin. And every time an African kingdom resisted, they were crushed. Not because they were weak, because Europe had already decided they didn't exist. On paper, those kingdoms weren't sovereign. They were territories, and territories don't have the right to defend themselves. Let me tell you what this did to Africa. It destroyed political systems that had existed for centuries. The Ashanti had a constitution, a council of elders, a legal system based on oral tradition and consensus. Britain replaced it with indirect rule. They installed chiefs who answered to British governors. They turned a sophisticated democracy into a puppet state. The Sokoto Caliphate had schools, libraries, a judicial system based on Islamic law. Britain and France split it apart. They redrew the borders so the Caliphate couldn't reunify. They installed their own emirs and called it local governance. This happened everywhere. Europe didn't just conquer Africa. They dismantled every institution that gave African societies structure. And then they taught African children that those institutions never existed. That's the real crime, not just the theft, the erasure of the memory of what was stolen. Now let's talk about what you were taught in school. If you learned about the Scramble for Africa at all, it was probably one paragraph. European nations competed for African territory in the late 1800s. The Berlin Conference was held to avoid conflict. Africa was colonized. That's it. No mention of the kingdoms that were destroyed. No mention of the fact that Africans weren't invited. No mention of the arbitrary borders or the treaties signed under false pretenses. And definitely no mention of why it happened. Because if you understood why, you'd have to confront something uncomfortable. Europe was running out of resources. The Industrial Revolution needed raw materials. Rubber for tires, copper for wires, diamonds for drills, gold for currency, and Africa had all of it. But African kingdoms controlled those resources. They set the prices. They controlled the trade routes. Europe couldn't just take what they wanted, not while African states had sovereignty. So they removed that sovereignty legally, on paper, in Berlin, and then they went in and took everything. This wasn't about civilization, it was about capitalism, and the proof is in what they took. From the Congo, they took rubber and ivory. From South Africa, diamonds and gold. From Nigeria, palm oil and cocoa. From Ghana, gold and timber. They built railroads, not to help Africans travel, to move resources from the interior to the coast faster. They built ports, not for African trade, to ship stolen goods back to Europe. Everything they built was extraction infrastructure. And when Africans resisted, they were killed. The Herero and Namakwa genocide in Namibia, the Maji Maji rebellion in Tanzania, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, millions dead for resisting the theft of their own land. That's what the Berlin Conference created. A system where African lives didn't matter, where African sovereignty was a legal fiction, where resistance was a crime. And here's what nobody talks about. The borders drawn in Berlin are still the borders today. When African nations gained independence in the 1950s and 60s, they kept the colonial borders, not because those borders made sense, but because changing them would have meant war. Because Europe had drawn the line so deliberately badly that any attempt to redraw them would have triggered conflict. The Somali people are still divided across 5 countries. The Bakongo Kingdom is still split between 3 nations. Ethnic groups that were united for centuries are still separated by borders they didn't choose. And when those borders cause conflict, Africa gets blamed for tribalism, but the tribes didn't draw the borders. Europe did, in Berlin, in 1884. And the fact that you didn't know that is not an accident. Let's go deeper into what this means, because the consequences of Berlin aren't just political, they're psychological. When you grow up in a country whose borders were drawn by foreigners, you learn that your geography is not your own. When you're taught that your kingdom didn't matter, that it wasn't a real nation, you learn that your history doesn't count. When the maps in your classroom were made in Europe, you learn that even the shape of your continent is someone else's definition. This is what colonization does. It doesn't just take your land. It takes your sense of ownership over your own existence. And that theft started in Berlin. Think about the audacity. 14 nations, not one of them African. They sat in a room and decided that they had the right to divide an entire continent. They didn't ask, they didn't negotiate, they didn't even pretend to care what Africans thought. They just drew lines and called it legal. And the world accepted it, not because it was right, because Europe had the guns and the ships and the lawyers to enforce it. This is the story you weren't told, not because it's hidden in archives. It's in every history book, but it's told as if it was inevitable, as if it was progress, as if Africa was just sitting there waiting to be claimed. That's the lie. Africa wasn't empty, it was full of kingdoms and cultures and systems that had existed long before Europe decided they didn't count. And the Berlin Conference wasn't diplomacy, it was conspiracy, a coordinated agreement to commit theft on a continental scale. Here's the final piece. The scramble for Africa didn't end with colonization. It's still happening. The borders drawn in Berlin are still in use. The systems of extraction are still in place. The resources are still being taken. Cobalt from the Congo for your smartphone, cocoa from Ghana for your chocolate, oil from Nigeria for your car. The products changed, the process didn't. And the reason you don't see the connection is because the story of Berlin was erased. If you understood that Africa was divided at a conference table, you'd ask who benefits from keeping those divisions in place. If you understood that the borders were drawn to break African unity, you'd question why those borders are still treated as sacred. If you understood that the whole system was designed for extraction, you'd see that extraction never stopped. It just got a new name. Development, investment, trade, same theft, different vocabulary. So why does this matter now? Because history isn't past, it's present. Every conflict in Africa that gets blamed on tribalism has roots in Berlin. Every resource war that gets framed as corruption has roots in extraction systems built during colonization. Every border dispute that gets called African chaos was caused by lines drawn by Europeans who never set foot on the continent. But you'll never hear that in the news, because if you understood the cause, you'd question the narrative. And the narrative is this: Africa is broken because Africans can't govern themselves. That's what they want you to believe. The truth is different. Africa is divided because Europe divided it. In Berlin, in 1884, at a conference designed to prevent Africans from having any say in their own future. That's not conspiracy, that's history. documented, verified, undeniable, but it's not taught, because teaching it would mean admitting that the system was designed to fail. And if the system was designed to fail, then the blame doesn't fall on Africa. It falls on the people who drew the borders in the first place. Let me leave you with this. The scramble for Africa is often presented as a tragic chapter that's now over. It's not over. The scramble is still happening. The resources are still being extracted. The borders are still causing conflict. And the same nations that sat in Berlin in 1884 are still profiting. Not through direct colonization, through debt, through trade agreements, through multinational corporations that operate with more power than African governments. The mechanisms changed, the structure didn't. And the reason this continues is because the original crime was never acknowledged. There was no apology for Berlin, no reparations for the kingdoms that were destroyed, no attempt to redraw the borders in a way that actually reflects African cultures and nations. Instead, we got independence, which is not the same as sovereignty, because independence means you control your government. Sovereignty means you control your resources, and Africa never got that second part back. This is the story they don't teach, not because it's complicated, not because the evidence is unclear, but because it's too revealing. It shows that the system was designed, that the poverty wasn't accidental, that the borders weren't natural. It shows that Africa's problems are not African in origin. They were imported, imposed, drawn on maps in European capitals by men who saw an entire continent as nothing more than raw material. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Every time you hear about conflict in Africa, you'll remember Berlin. Every time someone blames corruption, you'll remember the systems that were built to extract wealth. Every time you see a border that makes no sense, you'll remember that it was never meant to make sense. It was meant to divide, and it worked. For over a century, those divisions have held, not because they're right, but because undoing them would require admitting they were wrong from the start. So what do you do with this information? You remember it, you share it. You refuse to accept the sanitized version of history that pretends colonization was somehow benevolent. You recognize that the scramble for Africa was not chaos. It was order, European order, designed to benefit Europe at the expense of an entire continent. And you ask the question that makes people uncomfortable. If the Berlin Conference was legal, then what does that say about the law? If 14 nations could divide a continent without the consent of the people who lived there, and it was internationally recognized, then what does that say about international recognition? If the borders drawn by thieves are still the borders in use today, then who really won independence? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions that dismantle the entire narrative. And once you start asking them, you see the scramble for what it really was. Not history, architecture, a system built in 1884 that's still standing today. This is the knowledge they don't want you to have, not because it's false, because it's true. And the truth about the scramble for Africa destroys every justification for why the continent looks the way it does today. The borders aren't African. The poverty isn't natural. The conflicts aren't inevitable. They're all products of a conference held in Berlin by men who believed they had the right to own the world. And the fact that this isn't taught in schools, isn't discussed in the media, isn't part of the mainstream conversation about Africa, tells you everything you need to know. Because if people understood how Africa was divided, they'd understand how it's still being controlled. And that understanding is dangerous, not to Africa, to the system that profits from keeping Africa divided. So here's what I'll ask you. Now that you know this, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to accept the version of history that erases Berlin from the story? Or are you going to recognize that the scramble for Africa was one of the most calculated acts of theft in human history, and its effects are still being felt today, because this isn't ancient history. This is the foundation of the modern world. And the modern world was built on African resources, taken without consent, divided without input, and controlled without accountability. That's the legacy of Berlin. And it's a legacy that's still being written. If you want to understand how the world actually works, you have to understand how it was designed. And it was designed in rooms like the one in Berlin by men who believed they had the right to redraw the map of the world. They didn't, but they did it anyway. And we're still living in the world they created. This is what they don't teach. This is what they hope you never learn. But now you know. And knowledge is the first step to undoing what was done. If you want more stories like this, stories that reveal the history they tried to erase, subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold, because the truth doesn't stay buried forever, and it's time Africa's story was told the way it actually happened, not the way they wished it had.